Next, please welcome to the stage Isaiah Oliver, the Deputy Chief of Party for the USAID Climate Finance Development Accelerator Program at Chemonics, Kavita Sinha, Director of the Private Sector Facility at the Green Climate Fund, and Thilan Wijesinghe, Chairman and CEO of TWCorp Private Limited. This panel, Beyond Bridgetown, Private Sector and the Energy Transition, will be moderated by veteran journalist Maggie Lake.
I've been the chairperson all day, adding chairs and taking them away. Thanks, everyone. It's great to be back again and have this fantastic panel with us. And I feel like we just got handed a beautiful baton segue because I heard them say that it can't be public alone. We need private financing and some predictability. And all three of our fantastic panelists are expert in that topic. And in fact, through all the conversations, when we're talking about accelerating the need for speed and to make change to meet the goals, financing is absolutely critical and key component of that. So let's kick off with you, Isaiah. We were joking, Isaiah wasn't sure he's going to make this because he's been on the road so much, but I think that means you've got your finger on the pulse. So talk to me a little bit about the funding shortfall, because that's the reality, right? We need more money put toward these goals. What do you think the biggest barrier is when it comes to the energy transition for investments? What's standing in the way?
Yeah, thanks, Maggie. So I just came back from Bridgetown, Barbados last week, where I was helping launch an activity managed by our program, the Caribbean Climate Investment Program, and got a good opportunity to connect with some folks on the ground to hear about what are those barriers. I mean, first, I think there's the first one is one that we talk about nonstop, which is that we need new ways to scale the deployment of private capital, and particularly those investors that are currently sitting on the sidelines, whether commercial investors and particularly institutional investors that have the access to the deep pockets of capital that are really going to be needed to take us from billions to trillions, as we're just talking about. But I also think, from being in Barbados, we also have activities or partnerships that are focused in much larger emerging markets like India, South Africa. And it is important to note that ultimately the challenges are really centered around de-risking that private investment and figuring out ways to convince those investors to come in. But the specific barriers do vary quite a bit. In the Caribbean context, really what is standing in the way is a lack of pipeline. And even if we can convince some of these larger investors to come in, they're not going to come in.
Pipeline of money as opposed to pipelines in the ground?
Pipeline of projects, sorry.
Pipeline of projects.
Yeah, so
okay.
Projects that are there, that are ready, that have been designed, that have gotten permits. We heard the previous panel talking about permitting in the U.S. And that so investors can look at those projects and say, like, okay, I have faith that this project is going to move forward and get to the point to be constructed and then eventually functioning and providing that renewable energy or transmission capacity or whatever it is that is critical for the energy transition to move forward. And so that's sort of one example of a barrier. But
I think that makes sense. And I think that we heard them touch on predictability, right? I mean, this is the way. There's a format to investing in how it's traditionally done, and they were trying to apply that lens, and in some cases it's not there. Kavita, before we move any further, could you sort of explain the role that you all play in this, because it's kind of this hybrid middle ground that seems so essential. Can you give us kind of a layman's explanation?
Yeah, well, GCF, the Green Climate Fund, is I would say, the only international financial institute that was set up in the 21st century. We are a very high-risk capital, and we are patient capital, and our only mandate in town is to be ensuring that the developing country have the funds to make mitigation and adaptation to climate easier for them. So that's what we do. And we have the role that I play within that is to enable, using our capital, which is public money, is to enable private sector to invest in developing countries and move from the billions to the trillions. We take risks that others can't take. We stay in the projects for much longer than others. What that we hope allows the private capital, commercial and institutional investors to then reprice how they think of risks in these projects and come in behind us so that they can then together have enough pool of capital to make the investments work where they are needed.
The idea of patient capital, I think, makes sense to many of us, and it exists in the traditional finance world. Yeah. Anytime you're going to market or you're doing a roadshow, you want those big, longer-term investors in that patient capital and that are not going to cut and run when things get tough. So that makes sense to be that. And understandably why this is such an important element of that. Thilan, you are in the private sector now and have your own investment bank, but have decades of experience working in government, advising government, and now on the outside trying to move the needle. What do you identify as the challenges? And we're going to jump to some of the things that are working as well, because I think there is a lot of progress. But what's the challenge? And over that sort of the many years of experience you've had, how has the conversation changed around this?
I think the key challenge is to ensure that a country and a private sector that's seeking international capital, particularly a developing country, has a proper set of rules, regulations, consistency, credibility, stable macroeconomics. And if those elements are there, generally private capital knows how to price risk. For example, in the late 90s, when I was headhunted by the government, we were in a situation where Sri Lanka had war, had a conflict. And we were able to nevertheless raise about $1 billion worth of infrastructure related financing and financially close those. However, fast forwarding many years into the future, we have now a situation where the country has actually declared bankruptcy and we are going through a debt restructuring process. And is now, having had a 20-some year head start, is struggling to attract capital. So it's important for us to learn back what we have unlearned over the years and build the sort of institutional strength, institutional structures, rules, regulations to attract capital, such as what Kavita was speaking about from the GCF. And I want to make just one more point, and this capital is not just limited to the country itself, because Sri Lanka is one country that has a potential to export energy up to about 50 gigawatts of offshore wind. So therefore, I believe that this capital also needs to look at the regional context, where countries can share power through shared grids within the geographical location that it's situated in.
Yeah, Isaiah, this brings up a point, I think, and Thilan, is it credibility? Is it without any ratings, just the international investors looking at you and looking at Sri Lanka and saying, this is not a bet this is not a place I can put my money? Is it?
Yes. What international investors look for is, certainly they would look for credit enhancements in certain situations, but not in a situation where the off-taker, which is the purchaser of energy, is bankrupt and has defaulted on existing power purchase contracts. Okay. So that needs to be put right now. There are more than one South Asian country, including Sri Lanka, that has defaulted on power purchase contracts. So it will take years to build confidence, but in that interim period, it's important to put the house in order, and that's where intermediaries such as Chemonics and first loss guarantee type financing that's provided by GCF becomes extremely important in pressuring those countries to put the rules, regulations, and frameworks in place so that you can go from an unviable electricity sector to a viable sector. And there's usually a transition period, about 3 to 5 years, within which we can achieve that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Isaiah, this I think fills in some gaps, because we hear and we know that there's all this money on the sideline, right? We've seen the huge investment shifts. Whether it's BlackRock or, moving funds to ESG and earmarking funds to ESG, and then you hear that money is sitting on the sideline, but they have no projects. Why is that happening, and how do we bridge that gap?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things that we can do to bridge the gap. To Thilan's point, I think that private investors can assess risk, and they certainly have established methodologies. but at the same time, some of those investors that are sitting on the sidelines, I mean, we're asking them to look at and consider markets that they maybe have never invested in. And so naturally, they are going to, the perception that they're going to have of risk associated with those investments is frequently not in line with what actual investment performance is on the ground. And so what can we do? I mean, there are lots of different tools. I think from our perspective, our project, we're partnering with USAID, and we're using grant capital as well as technical assistance and looking for where we have the greatest opportunities to be catalytic in bridging that risk gap, to get investors to the point that where they do feel comfortable and are willing to go in, and with the hopes that we can then scale back that assistance and then allow the market to work as we, I think, all want it to do.
Yeah, Kavita, it's really the same issue. What do you see in terms of helping close that? And do investors have an accurate sense of the risk of these projects?
That's a very good question. I think there are two types of risk, right? There's a perceived risk. If you haven't been in that market, then you don't know what the risks are. And if you can't qualify or quantify the risk, the investor doesn't want to go there. So that's the perceived risk. And then there's the real risk. As Thilan mentioned, there's the government, there's the institution. Many of them may not yet be stable. Some are still in formation. So what can capital do in that place? The role that USAID and you play is to enable that policy de-risking, to create that stable environment so that others can price. What institutions such as GCF, what we can do is we provide a de-risking layer of capital. If projects, let's say a private sector project on its merit has good profit-making ability, it's bankable by itself, but it is hampered by the country's risk perception. If the country has either it doesn't have any credit rating or has very poor credit rating, good solid projects underneath it will not be able to bridge that risk perception. So we had, when we understood this in talking to the countries where we work with, we helped create an international institution for guarantees, the Green Guarantee Company, which is will be located out of a developed country, and its sole purpose is to credit enhance bonds that the private developers might issue from developing countries to access Western capital, which is oftentimes cheaper and longer duration, but it's not available here where they need it most. And so our guarantee company will issue the guarantee to credit enhance them, which might bridge the gap between the country's guarantee and what a creditworthy financier wants to invest in. So those are some of the examples we're doing. We also do equity investments in ventures in developing countries who might want to bring in technology or scale technologies or create supply chains in local markets that will enable them to foster this longer-term development goals. And we have so far, of the nearly $13 billion that GCF's own capital has gone into, we have mobilized about $50 billion in total, but that's still very little. If you're looking at even just a single transition of energy transition, we need trillions and trillions of dollars every year. And not just in transitioning from fossil to clean, but also meeting the growing demand. Right, and then and those last mile customers. So there's a variety of needs, and we do this in a variety of ways to enable that, from the project preparation to actual financing to equity investments, and prepare sort of really that comes from listening to all the ecosystem partners or where the need is so that we can customize our tools to them.
Which seems like it's an incredibly important component, Thilan. I mean, you're dealing with this, and it's not just the project itself, it's in the context of all the other economic conditions that are happening.
Actually, Maggie, it's in that context that Sri Lanka, about a year ago, is embarking on probably the most ambitious reform process of the power sector undertaken anywhere in South Asia, where despite the fact that we have 100% penetration in electricity, the government has announced an ambitious plan of migrating from about 40% renewable to 70%. And in the next month or two, we'll implement a groundbreaking legislation of unbundling the Central Electricity Board into separate generation, distribution, and transmission companies, of which generation and distribution will be privatized. And the government has built a pipeline of about 3,000 megawatts of renewable energy projects on top of the requirement to decarbonize the coal-fired plant and to privatize some of the generation assets. So Sri Lanka alone, just for its domestic market, can attract several billions of the capital that you spoke about, Kavita. And here, if I was asked, what is your one wish in order to attract that capital? Number one would be technical assistance to build that capacity within the government and the relevant government institutions. Number two would be access to blended financing. Why? Because a point that was made in the previous discussion, in order to make renewable energy more stable in terms of its ability to provide stability to the grid, you need to look at new technologies. And in Sri Lanka in particular, where we have tapped virtually 100% of the hydro resources, we need to build pump storage because of the vagaries of weather. And then we need to migrate towards battery storage because we have yet to tap a vast potential of solar that we have. And as I mentioned earlier, we have 50 plus gigawatts of wind, of which more than half is in shallow waters offshore. So the point is that if I were to have, as a country, blended finance, technical assistance, and the credit enhancement that you spoke about, we again become a regional powerhouse, actually, not just to generate renewable energy in our country, but to export it to countries such as India.
Yeah, and we're talking about accelerating. It sounds like that's what's needed. I'm interested, all of you seem to be filling not only the capital role, but a role of sort of local expertise and knowledge in some way. Is that lacking in some of the countries because of either the nature or non-existence of capital markets and the financial markets? Is that, how important is that, Thilan? And let's go right down the line on that.
I mean, a country such as Sri Lanka with a $90 billion GDP per capita, its financial markets are thin. So in order to look at 15 to 20-year tenor money, it's impossible. And for the banking system, the domestic banking system alone to finance migration to renewable energy, it's next to impossible. So what tends to get done, it's the smaller projects, the mini hydros, that 5 to 10 megawatts do get financed by local banks, but they don't necessarily produce the economy of scale.
Yeah.
So absolutely, we need to tap into international capital. And then comes the issue of how do you hedge against foreign exchange risk. So I believe just as much as an investment bank, I can say this, a great degree of financial engineering innovation is going to be needed over the next few years to complement all of what's been discussed in this forum, and the role that financial intermediaries would play in ensuring that financial risk and de-risk instruments are built into the process of energy procurement, trading, etc., is going to be really important over the next few years.
Isaiah, it doesn't sound like you are all working on that. It doesn't sound like we have enough of it in place in order to try to achieve that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to get to your question about the importance of the local ecosystem, local partners, I mean, I think that ultimately when we talk about mobilizing this institutional investment, those institutional investors aren't going to actually go to the country and do the investments. They're going to find trust. It comes down to trust. We talk about it in risk, but it's ultimately trust. And having partners, whether they're fund managers, project developers, otherwise, local financial institutions that understand those markets, have the capacity and have a track record, which I think is something that we're supporting, but need to continue to do. That alone is going to make a huge difference, so that those investors, when they want to move money, they have folks they know they can trust and that they want to work with.
Yeah, is that your experience, Kavita? I saw you shaking your head when Thilan was talking about needing technical assistance. No,
definitely. I think one of the challenges, and I was in a meeting earlier where, small island nation countries also brought this up. Some of the financial institutions, the procedures of applying for it, the creation of the funding proposal that meets the standards of actually getting the funding, that if that capacity is lacking, then you don't even come to get to the funding. Right. So technical assistance plays a very important role. At GCF, we do have something called the Project Preparation Facility, where we take the risk of providing that fund upfront. for the countries to develop, for private sector to develop the project. And if they bring the project to us and we successfully fund it, then we would seek the private sector to reimburse us. But if we don't, then that's lost money. So again, that's the type of risk I think more institutions need to take that. It's not enough, even though there might, I mean, this whole myth about there's a lot of capital but not enough project, I think I would like to spin it on its head and say that there's not enough risk capital to be able to develop the quality project that the non-risk finance that's sitting out there is willing to take that risk.
Yeah, that's a great distinction. Isaiah, I see you shaking your head vigorously.
Yeah.
Do we need to rethink that?
Yes, I mean, we do. I will say, you know, one of the things that I love about my job is I get to interact with a lot of innovative thinkers in this space, and there are folks who are trying to come up with innovative models for what Kavita is mentioning, which is bringing more risky capital earlier in the process to build out that pipeline. And so I think it's a matter of just continuing to, you know, accelerate some of those efforts and try to figure out a way to do it at scale, which is really challenging.
So I'm curious, when you say that, for those of us who, you know, may come in contact with a different part of finance, I mean, we have a very well-developed VC private equity universe where everyone's looking for the next unicorn and take enormous risks and invest millions in companies that they never see another dime from. It doesn't sound like that's happening here, or is it just lack of knowledge? Because certainly that's happening in other parts of financial circles. What is your sense? Thilan, are you seeing, I mean, because they're huge returns. With risk comes potentially huge returns. Not always, but you know, if you're doing it right.
No, that's a great point. I don't think there's enough concessional, or what we call blended capital, which is available at less than commercial rates in the world to help particularly the countries in the South to migrate towards decarbonization and renewables. So it is with that level of blended capital that we could actually encourage the global South to adopt modern technology, particularly when it comes to battery storage and other innovations in wind energy, and as I was mentioning earlier, pump storage. So I think the global capital pool, and certainly this is less riskier than venture capital or going after tech startups, need to expand vastly beyond the Jeff Bezoses, the Guggenheims and the Gates Foundations of this world to actually make the billions into trillions, so that this blended capital, along with more institutional capital such as the GCF, can work in tandem, provide the technical assistance to the countries through companies such as Chemonics, and possibly ourselves, where we bring local knowledge to companies such as Chemonics, to actually help countries to migrate towards decarbonization and renewables. And it's a huge need. You're absolutely right, Maggie.
Yeah.
I think energy is more challenging for venture-type investments because, you know, at the end of the day, especially for the global South, affordable energy is linked to social and economic development. And then it's also hampered by regulations of the government, so policy and regulations, which luckily you don't have to deal with when you're setting up yet another e-commerce platform or a dating app, for example. But energy is difficult, and that has to be recognized. It is a more challenging sector to invest in. However, I think we have, more creative solutions. It's a matter of scaling them up. For GCF, that we're looking at three types of energy transition demand for our capital. One is from decarbonizing the existing fossil, as Thilan mentioned. The second is actually in those countries such as Africa, which are just starting their growth journey. So actually scaling up. There's a huge opportunity to go green from start. And that's where I think more institutional capital needs to combine with us, which brings in the blending as a public institution and a private and commercial finance together, which could make the profit happen at the rates that they want. And then there is the energy access challenge. So where, again, we have funded a lot of enterprises through equity investments, with co-financing from private capital, actually, that has set up huge amounts of ecosystems within the local country context, which is now beginning to grow. But they don't see the same growth rate in capital investment as a developed country venture would see. You know, I was speaking with this early stage developer. They still called early stage. They have been in the business for 10 years. If they were in the U.S. in 10 years, they no more called early stage, right? You know, so it's a very successful enterprise, but they're still struggling to scale.
Yeah, that is the. Thilan, are there? You've kind of ridden rather the wave in Sri Lanka, had great success, saw it sort of move backwards, and now once again working on it. Are there lessons that we can take from that on what works, what moves the needle, and then what to avoid? You mentioned the need for, rule of law and standards, but what lessons should we take away from the Sri Lankan experience?
I think one of the key lessons would be transparency and competition in procurement. Nothing beats market pricing when it comes to energy procurement, where you would call for global tenders and invite the world to bid for a given energy project. And obviously, if you're issuing requests for proposals for such projects, we have to make sure that the ground situation of the government officials who negotiate with the successful bidders is conducted professionally with minimal, if no corruption whatsoever. So that becomes a crucial factor. Now, in Sri Lanka, we've seen, because of certain inefficiencies in the market, less and less interest compared to the late 90s by well-known international energy companies to bid for RFPs that have come out. Now, that's got to change. Of course, the other lessons is fiscal responsibility within the energy off-takers. In Sri Lanka, it's been a monopoly so far. It's now getting unbundled. But what happened was the electricity monopoly also decided to get into the energy generation business of its own, because there were some donors who were willing to give money for that. For example, I don't want to mention a particular donor, but about 5 years back, I have actually objected to it. A well-known international donor gave the money to the state-owned electricity off-taker, go build a 100-megawatt wind energy plant, which we are now going to be looking at privatizing once unbundling happens. So these are some of the lessons. And I think the availability of blended and long-term patient capital such as GCF can be used as a stick or a carrot, so to speak, for governments to reform themselves when it comes to renewable energy. And you made a very interesting point earlier, and that is there's no other form of energy that is at the heart of the rural poor, whether it is for water pumping or small-scale irrigation or cultivation. The price of energy matters, or industrialization. The price of energy matters. So the government needs to have the best sources of financing, the cheapest sources of financing, and the most competitive, transparent procurement process in order to garner that benefit.
Isaiah, the political aspect of it, reform aspect of it, is big and thorny.
Yeah. I want to make one point that sort of builds off what Thilan's saying, which is the need for more blended finance tools, as well as the importance of transparent and competitive processes in some of this. So over the past 7 or 8 months, I've been working on something that's been sort of on the other side of what Thilan's is advocating for, which is running a structured competitive process for fund managers that are looking to raise capital to launch energy transition related funds focused on primarily the JETP countries, the Just Energy Transition Partnership countries. At the beginning of that process, a lot of people said, we were looking at a minimum, basically $500 million fund, so pretty large scale. And a lot of folks kind of came up to us and said, we don't think that there's actually going to be, you might get a couple of fund managers who will come forward. We had $15 million in catalytic grant funding that we were going to provide to mobilize this money. And, lo and behold, we get 33 proposals with a lot of innovative concepts that are really structured specifically around mobilizing institutional capital, figuring out ways in which investment funds can be structured in a way that really meets their needs and speaks to what is going to take to push those institutional investors over the line and get money flowing.
So that sounds like an incredibly powerful message and sign if there's that much interest.
Yeah.
And the role they play, would it be much like you're all playing as a sort of that intermediary between very large institutional money and the destination where it needs to go? Does it act as that sort of catalyst?
Exactly. Yep. So we essentially all those proposals were from GPs, general partners, who are the fund managers who are really the ones that are, going out and finding that pipeline of projects and really trying to push the needle and expanding that pipeline. And then they're on the other side, they're working with the institutional investors to make sure they're comfortable to bring them in, and then ultimately generate the returns that are going to meet their needs. Because when we talk about institutional investors, it's easy to say like, oh, you should invest, but sometimes they're responsible for managing teachers' pension funds.
Oh, absolutely. They have a lot of restrictions on the quality that of the projects they're able to invest in to protect they have a fiduciary responsibility to stick by their mandate. Do we have any questions in the room while we're talking? If we do, just let me know or shout them out. Kavita, what's the pipeline look like? We heard the pipeline. I was joking with Isaiah, because we are in the energy forum. But what does the project pipeline look like, and where you see the most interest?
For GCF, the demand for our capital is much higher than what our capital base is. So the project pipeline is not really the problem for us. It's raising the capital for ourselves is what is the bigger challenge. Having said that, I think the demand is diversified now. In our beginning, when GCF started operations, there was a lot of demand. Largely, most of the demand was for renewable energy. But now that more and more private capital and institutional capital have become familiar with renewable energy in developing countries, I think the demand for our capital has shifted somewhat. We are seeing a lot more demand in resilient agriculture. We are seeing a lot more demand in water and wastewater. We are seeing a lot more demand in what normally is called adaptive capacity and resilience building, resilient infrastructure that can withstand the increasing volatility of the climate impacts, the hurricanes, typhoon. So our demand base for capital is shifting. I also wanted to touch upon the point that Isaiah was making about the demand from a lot of general partners and fund managers has also increased to work with us. Now that we have created this whole body of investments, there's a lot of lessons that is embedded in our work, which we haven't been able to bring to the market. But general partners and fund managers now want to work more and more with us to be able to innovate before they can then go to institutional capital to use those examples into the market. So we do need more market players to capture the knowledge that we have, to be able to create sort of standardized valuation methodologies of what blended finance different stacks value is, so that the risk can be repriced appropriately. There's not enough model to do that for blended finance now. So if we need some more intermediaries in the system so that our dollars can go further, faster.
Has it been, we all know anecdotally that there has the issue of ESG investing, sustainable investing can be politicized. There has been backlash. Do you feel any of that, or in terms of boots on the ground, is the interest high and it's just a matter of ironing out some of these issues of de-risking and capacity building?
For GCF, we are a climate first. And we look at sustainability also, so not just do no harm, but also do good. So for a climate perspective, we have a well-developed methodology. We have our own integrated results management framework, very detailed methodology. Our systems are very transparent. So in fact, GCF's participation, oftentimes for serious investors who want to be in climate or sustainability, that actually is very encouraging for them to come behind us. But that has not become a universal process yet.
Isaiah, what about you? What messaging do you think needs to happen to sort of draw more, especially when all of you are providing this really important bridge? What can pull more capital into these projects and close that funding gap?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing that I see is just the need for greater collaboration. Kavita and I were talking before about how our project is sort of working alongside GCF on multiple different initiatives. I think that a lot of us want to be able to put our name on something and say it's like our fund or our, but ultimately, like, what we're trying to do is we're trying to push forward a transformation that is arguably unprecedented in human history, and like we need to work together, and we need to find ways that people can feel pride and credit for these initiatives, but also work to pool capital together and collaborate.
Yeah, we keep coming back to strategic partnerships every conversation we have, but these problems are just too complex not to do that, even on the financing side. Thilan, last word to you. Are you feeling optimistic?
Yes, I am. In fact, if I may say so, Sri Lanka is probably the only country in the world that anticipated climate change 2,000 years ago when we built probably the world's finest irrigation canals and tanks on a cascading system to actually grow more food in some of the dry areas of Sri Lanka. So I think the time has come now where there's a greater degree of collaboration and innovation in blurring the lines between adaptation and mitigation, so that on the one hand, mitigation in the form of renewable energy can lead to better agricultural practices with more innovation and new technology coming in, and then of course linking it with water management. So that's the need of the hour. I think we need to go back to history, learn a few things, and adopt it to the modern world.
Well, thankfully, we have veterans like you who've been working at this public-private partnership for a long time to help guide us. And all of you, thank you for the really important work that you're doing to sort of, be that bridge and help us all understand these financing needs on a much more detailed level and not just the broad strokes. I think we need a more in-depth conversation on it. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.